Okay, who doesn't like a little bit of climate change and politics? I got weary of it about 10 years ago, but it shows no sign of going away. Let's cross down to Canberra now and catch up with Coalition Senator and former Resources Minister Matt Canavan. Good to talk to you, Matt.
Good to be with you here, Chris.
Now, you must be very interested in Joel Fitzgibbon resigning from Labor's front bench, essentially over climate and energy policy. You'd have a lot in common with Joel Fitzgibbon. It's probably a good thing, isn't it, that Labor are not taking his advice?
Look, I suppose you could cast it with that pale from a political perspective for us, but I think it's very disappointing for our nation that there's not room for the likes of Joel Fitzgibbon in the modern Labor Party anymore. I mean, Joel was one of the very few within Labor who was actually standing up for people's real jobs, you know, standing up for miners, standing up for the future development of our nation. Things that former Labor leaders would have just been their breakfast, you know. John Curtin helped and Chifley helped build the Snowy scheme. They would have just been doing this thing as a matter of course, but of course in the modern Labor Party they just basically don't want to do anything, and certainly don't want to create new mines or build new dams, and there's no place for the likes of Joel in the modern Labor Party, and that is disappointing for us as a nation, because we do really need bipartisan support to get things happening in this country. So hopefully Labor will wake up to themselves. But the message for all Australians who do want to see jobs created, who do want to see our country get ahead, is that the Labor Party has been taken over by a bunch of crazy lefties that even Joel Fitzgibbon, a lifelong member of the Labor Party, can't cop anymore.
Look, it's extraordinary to watch because, as you say, Joel Fitzgibbon is just talking about sensible policy. He's not opposed to renewable energy and climate action. He's just saying you've got to still have mines, that coal's going to be a part of the mix for a long while to come. Of course, his electorate is a coal mining electorate. And we had all these arguments in the federal election, and you saw firsthand taking on that convoy opposed to Adani, and that tore the Labor Party apart. It lost them a lot of votes in Queensland. Yet they seem to be dictated by people like Mark Dreyfus and other inner city politicians who just want the Labor Party to be more like the Greens.
Yeah, the Labor Party used to be a party that would actually have workers in leadership positions representing other workers in the community. And unfortunately today it's basically become a vehicle for those that are either after a career in politics, along the likes of Mark Dreyfus, as you mentioned, or others who are ideologically committed to extremely radical policies. You might recall a couple of weeks ago, Chris, that there was an intense debate in the Labor Shadow Cabinet apparently about whether or not we should be able to keep our household gas appliances. You know, whether or not we should continue to encourage or allow people to use gas in their homes, because a radical Labor fringe group, the Labor Environmental Action Network, wanted to transition away from household gas appliances. And, you know, this was a literal barbecue stopper of a policy. It was about taking people's barbecues away. But they had to debate this. You know, they had to debate. Eventually, Joel was in the room back then, so eventually they did land apparently on the side of, well, gas can still stay for now. But they actually had to have a debate. There was actually a contest in the Labor Party about this issue. That's just a small window into the crazy stuff that goes on at the moment.
It sounds too absurd to be true, but I know you're telling the truth. That is actually the case. The Labor Environmental Action Group, LEAN, they want to ban gas cooktops and gas barbecues, a literal barbecue stopper. I think, though, the good news for the country and for the Labor Party, maybe bad news for the coalition in terms of political differentiation later on, is that Labor is obviously going to come to its senses. Surely Joel Fitzgibbon now will gather with other people in the right faction of the Labor Party and get them back towards sensible climate and energy policies.
But this is the trick here, Chris. If that does happen, if there's sort of a move to paper over these cracks, to put some polyfiller into these large cracks in the Labor Party between now and the next election, that will just be a massive cover-up job. That will be their attempt to say one thing before an election and do the opposite after, because we've seen inside the Labor Party soul here today, and they just can't be trusted. So let's say in the next year, 18 months, the Labor Party starts saying, oh no, actually we support jobs, we support mining, etc., etc. We know there's the likes of Mark Dreyfus out there who want to take radical climate action. We know Mark Butler wants to sign ourselves up to an international agreement that would hamstring Queensland and Australian industries. That's what they're going to do. And just keep in mind, the last time a Labor leader won an election here in this country, a guy called Kevin Rudd, he looked reassuring. He told everyone he was a fiscal conservative. And then what did he do as soon as after he got elected? He took the mask off. The mask came off, the spending started, the waste started, the debt got racked up, taxes was brought in, the borders were open again.
Hang on.
And that is still where the Labor Party are.
Well, I'll tell you what, no one's going to beat the amount of spending and debt that's been racked up this year by a coalition government, admittedly in response to a pandemic. But, man, that sort of obliterates anything that's happened in the past now. I want to come, Matt, to your side of politics, though, because you talk about a very pragmatic approach to energy and climate policy, and so does the current Energy Minister, Angus Taylor. But in the state governments, the state coalition governments, they're full on for net zero by 2050 and full on for a renewable push. The New South Wales state Liberal government has made a big announcement about that this year. They're at odds, aren't they, with the federal government policy and the federal government prescriptions?
Yeah, look, I shake my head sometimes about these state governments on these frolics. It's unfortunate often that they don't have to pay the consequences of the decisions they make, and we're continuing to see billions of dollars wasted on projects which don't add up to too much. I mean, we've seen recently this South Australia, New South Wales transmission line, which has been pushed heavily by those state governments in the last few years. Its costs have now blown out. They've doubled. It was going to cost $1.2 billion. It's now nearly $2.5 billion in cost just to hook up South Australia with the coal-fired power stations of New South Wales. And then on top of that, New South Wales comes out with a plan to say, we're going to shut down our coal-fired power stations and just put renewables in. So why are we building this extension lead? It's not going to save South Australia if that happens, and we're going to waste $2.5 billion. I think an emerging concern too, Chris, about these plans from state governments is the fact that they're pushed by politicians who don't have to live with the consequences. So these plans to put in massive amounts of solar power and wind turbines, they all happen away from the inner city seats where these politicians pushing these schemes actually live and reside and represent. There's no one going to put wind turbines up on Bondi Beach. No one's putting wind turbines up in Manly. But these policies are being pushed by people who live in these areas, and there is an increasing movement out there in the bush that's saying enough is enough. You know, we need our land to grow food. We need our land to create jobs, because once a solar panel farm comes in, there's no jobs around, mate. There is no jobs on a solar farm. The next time there'll be jobs once the solar farm's up and running is when they have to pull it all down and dig a big hole to dispose of them somewhere. And that's a real emerging issue in this country that not a lot of people realise, because they don't see these things firsthand.
And no country's done this. This is the great lie that's propagated in the media and politics, suggesting other countries have done this. In Germany, for instance, power costs have gone through the roof and they're still using coal-fired power. No country has been able to reduce its emissions in a cost-effective way on a large scale without having either nuclear power in the mix or access to a lot of hydroelectricity, which of course is pretty handy. Just before I let you go, Matt, did I hear you today objecting to the change of the wording in the national anthem? Do you think that one and free is not a worthwhile change?
Yeah, and I also saw you, Chris. I think you've written a column in favour, so I think we might disagree on this point. I don't think we should be subtracting from what is a great national anthem. I wouldn't necessarily have an issue with some additions to recognise additional Indigenous Australians if they were well made. I just concerned.
But how does the switch from young to one detract from anything?
Yeah, because we're a young nation. We're an old country.
And we are one.
No, hang on. No. We are an old country, but we are a young nation. We've only been a nation since 1901, and that's very young from a global perspective, and I think we should take some pride in that, because we're a place of renewal for people. We don't have the hang-ups of many other countries going back centuries, so that's why a lot of people like coming here. So I think that's an important point.
I think we're the 10th longest running democracy.
Yeah, but not as a nation.
About 200
countries. Those other countries have gone through. They've still been nations for longer than that. They just haven't been democratic nations. So that's not the point I'm making. But we are relatively young as a nation. We don't have ethnic conflicts that stretch back centuries, and I think it's an important distinction about Australia, and it expressed very succinctly in our anthem. So let's add to our history rather than try and take it away. And I think those that are seeking to, not suggesting you, Chris, but some of those suggesting this change are actually got a wider agenda here that is seeking to somehow tarnish the authors of our anthem by saying somehow, by just using the word young, they were seeking to denigrate our Indigenous history. I don't think that's right at all. I think it is a reference to the fact that we don't have the ethnic, tribal, historical hang-ups that many other countries have in the world, and we should cherish, protect and celebrate that.
Matt Canavan, thanks for joining us again. Always good to have you on the show.
Thanks, Chris.
Senator Matt Canavan there, live from Canberra. Let's